Good evening, everyone. It's great to be back here with you. It's exciting that as the lectures go on, we get more daylight. It's not pitch black at 5 o'clock anymore. So last week, we really focused on a history of Cranbrook Academy of Art and its architecture and the influences that impacted Saarinen's design for this campus. Tonight, we're going to sort of turn and go in a different direction. Instead of talking about Cranbrook, we're going to talk about the context and the sort of wider history of American architecture. Mid-century modernism as a style is really incubated here at Cranbrook in the late 30s and the early 40s, and yet we don't have a sort of supreme example of mid-century modern architecture. In fact, between Eero Saarinen's death in 1950 and then construction beginning again in the 1980s, which we'll talk about next week, there are essentially only two important works of architecture that are built on the Cranbrook campus in that 35-year span. We'll talk about one of them in detail, Edison House from 1966, and then we'll end with Gordon Hall of Science from 1976. So, when we last left our humble hero, he was here on Mount Olympus, and this is not Eero Saarinen's last work of architecture. I think it is his last great work of architecture, but he does design a number of projects after the completion of the museum in 1942. And one of those is a competition entry that he enters into the National Park Service for this monument to Thomas Jefferson's purchase of the Louisiana Purchase. And so this is the city of St. Louis on the Mississippi River, this monumental abstract arch. And then around it are the sort of requirements of the competition. So a planetarium and a theater grouping and then an art museum, this really sweeping program. The competition was launched in May of 1947, and there were 5 finalists chosen in September. And here at Cranbrook, Eero had entered, and he gets the telegram, E. Saarinen, Cranbrook, congratulations, you are a finalist in the competition. They have this multi-day party celebrating Eero's victory, and then they get a second telegram from Washington saying, sorry, there were 2 E. Saarinens, and of course, it was Eero Saarinen who won. Eero was selected over some 160 other architects, including a number of Cranbrook students and Cranbrook graduates. And he, unlike so many other entries, including his father, he really focuses on the monument. He ignores the sort of amphitheater and planetarium and museum, and he argues that there needs to be, in early phases, a 550-foot arch, in the end, a 620-foot arch, rising up on the banks of the Mississippi River, sort of this portal into manifest destiny. And we'll talk more about the construction and the design of the arch later. But remember, this is all happening in 1947. So when it opens in 1966, it was 19 years after he had won the competition. And tonight, I want to explore how we got from here at the Art Museum of 1942 to the Arch of 1966. And in this time at Cranbrook, we have our founders, George and Ellen, who pass away, Ellen in 48, George in 1949. Eero and Lloyd, who Eero steps down at the helm of the Academy in 46. He passes away in 1950. Lloyd leaves campus in 51. She passes away in 1968. Carl and Olga Millis, who in 1951, with Saarinen gone, Booth gone, moved back to Sweden. And so all of the sort of founding motivation, this founding force, is gone by the mid-century, by 1951. And we start to see new players shaping American design. So even though they were only on campus for from 38 to 41, we see Charles and Ray Eames with their designs Here, a tabletop snapshot from the Eames's studio at Cranbrook. Later, some of the iconic works of American furniture that come out of this husband and wife duo. We see Florence Knoll, who is a graduate of Kingswood School for Girls and the Academy of Art, here seen with her Knoll planning group in a meeting about, I think, Connecticut General Life Insurance. And we see some of the iconic pieces of furniture that Knoll would produce, including the womb chair designed in '48 by Eero Saarinen. Then there's graduates like Ralph Rapson with his case study house here. We see Eero and his office moving into this mid-century style, leaving his father's style behind. Eero attracts an international cohort of architects like Olav Hammerstrom, who works for Eero, marries head of weaving Marianne Strangel, and they build this vacation home in Massachusetts. Meanwhile, Detroit is a real center of modernism, with people like Alexander Gerard and his McLucas house in Grosse Pointe. And we really can't ignore Frank Lloyd Wright through this period. So Wright outlives Saarinen by a decade, and so Frank Lloyd Wright is a mid-century modernist architect. And then there are the Cranbrook graduates who go on into larger offices and bigger projects like Goya Obata, who at his retirement from his firm, HOK, in 2014, it was the largest architectural firm in the world, and this is an early Obata project. And so tonight's lecture, I'm going to focus the first half on mid-century modern houses and how we got here. And then the second half, I want to take Eero Saarinen as a case study, because Eero Saarinen Associates was one of the most interesting and influential architecture firms. And essentially, everything they do is happening between Eliel's death in 1950 and Eero's death in 1961. So 11 years, and they do projects like Dulles Airport. They do the chapel at MIT, the hockey rink at Yale, the dining hall in Yale College, TWA terminal at JFK, and of course, the Arch. And so in this one decade, you see this sort of festival of shapes and forms, this search for form, this really intense exploration of what does it mean to be a modernist architect. And we also see the importation of the idea of the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, and Saarinen and his compatriots searching for what does a building at the mid-century look like. And it's really radical to consider father and son in this situation. When Eero takes over the firm from his father after the death in 1950, he is at that point younger than his father was when he first stepped foot on Cranbrook's campus. So everything that Eliel builds here at Cranbrook is done in years of life that Eero never has. In that sense, he becomes almost this heroically tragic figure for getting so many buildings as he is able to out. And he was a man of the jet age. He flew on America's first jet transport in 1958. And it's just remarkable to think about his father sailing here on an ocean liner and getting to Michigan by train, and how much had changed from Saarinen building his own house in 1902 to his son sort of building this global brand. And there's a compelling argument to be made that Eero Saarinen was never at home, that airports were his greatest sort of genre to build in, because he was always traveling. He was always sort of tormented by what design would come next. And I want to start the lecture by reviewing American house architecture and how we got to the mid-century modern house. We're going way back in time. Just to use as an example, Gunston Hall, which is really underlined by its simplicity, this formal arrangement, 4 beautifully proportioned rooms with a hall in the center. All the rooms are contained here. There are no closets, there's no plumbing. It is architecture at its most primitive and architecture at its most enduring. This is a house typology that lasts for hundreds of years, all the way up to Frank Lloyd Wright building his own house, which is, again, little rooms, little cells. He's borrowing from history. We have the same sort of Palladian window that Buckland used. But Wright begins to think, is this the best way to build? And he begins exploring both new forms on the outside, but quite radically, Frank Lloyd Wright begins to eliminate the cells of a room. Part of that is just the demands of architecture. He's including plumbing here. So he's including things like kitchens. Machines are becoming inserted into the plan, and it really mars that sort of clarity of the primal house type. But then in 1902, 1903, Frank Lloyd Wright revolutionizes domestic architecture with the Ward Willets House in this pinwheel arrangement where you enter the home into a hall, the living room opens into the dining room, a central hearth, a complete flow of space, and it's the start of the open floor plan. And the Japanese influence on the outside, the horizontal stripes, it all is becoming more and more abstracted. And this really crystallizes for Wright the prairie style, which culminates in his greatest prairie house, the Roby House. It's precise, it's simple, it's elegant, and when we look at the floor plan, it becomes this sort of ideal image of the modern house for many years to come. The living room flowing to the dining room, and then a back wing of service with the bedrooms on top of it. And so here we see what Wright called his domestic agenda in 1931, a reduction of the number of rooms to the necessary minimum, the integration of the building to its site, the elimination of the cellular plan, the replacement of a basement with a podium, the unification of the interior and the exterior, the substitution of multiple materials by one material, the integration of mechanical services and furniture as much as possible, and the suppression of all applied decoration and ornament. And those 9 points go off to Europe, and they begin influencing the German architects. And it's this early architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright that is really latched onto in the German-speaking world, and that German-speaking world comes back to America with Alfred Barr and Johnson's MoMA show of 32, the international style. And so we see pavilions like Mies, where he's taken Frank Lloyd Wright's principles of planes of space, of floating walls, and he has minimized it even further than Frank Lloyd Wright ever dared go. We see Gropius, who is relying on Frank Lloyd Wright's open floor plans for making these very functional little boxes. And most of all, we see Le Corbusier, who's eliminated the basement. He's raised the entire house up on these thin columns, what he would call pilotis. It's all plaster, it's tile, it's this machine for living of these almost like World's Fair architecture materials. It looks perfect on day one, and you spend the rest of your life trying to keep your White House all white. And for Le Corbusier, I think that was very informative because he thought in sort of modular systems. And so his Citroën house, which was raising the first floor up, a 2-story living room on the sort of mechanical space below, private spaces on the back, and then a garden room at the top. And Le Corbusier is arguing in lectures, in text, and in buildings that this is how we live for a modern age. And Frank Lloyd Wright, whose career took a complete and utter disaster turn for the worst after he ran off with a client's wife and his house burned down. He moves to Japan. He comes back to California, these sort of lost years, and he builds essentially a Corbusian house for Los Angeles, a first floor of mechanical, a double height living room space, and a garden room on top. Except his is so much more tactile. It's these concrete blocks that are sort of woven together. So his seems like, yes, it will leak, but it should leak. You're here in the jungle. He loses that sort of machine aesthetic. And he attracts Europeans here. So, for example, Rudolf Schindler comes from Vienna and builds his own sort of Wrightian European blend of a concrete house. Later, Schindler will again adapt that Corbusian model of the functional mechanical space below, a 2-story living room and a garden terrace on top, with the Lovell Beach House. He invites another Austrian architect over, Richard Neutra, who steals all of his clients. And for the very same Dr. Lovell, we see Richard Neutra building, yet again, a house raised on thin columns and floating planes of space. And so you have these California experiments in the European manner. Frank Lloyd Wright is watching all of this and thinking, hold on, this is my genre, this is my architecture, and so he bests them with Falling Water. Falling Water successfully relaunches his career. It relaunches him onto the international stage. The inside of it is so much more, again, tactile than what the Germanic architects were doing. It's like living in a furnished cave as much as it is a house in the conventional sense. And when you look at it straight on, which is actually how you approach the house, you begin to see the direct parallels to Le Corbusier and the European modernist. And Frank Lloyd Wright would have wanted you to draw these parallels between his architecture. He did not see himself as a sort of idiosyncratic one-off, which is how many people would consider Wright. He saw himself as doing it first and then coming back and doing it best. But Frank Lloyd Wright is a sort of singular genius, and so we owe much of our mid-century modernism to the same Germanic architects, this sort of two-pronged German invasion of evacuees. They're chased out by the Nazis from the Bauhaus, Mies on the left, Gropius on the right. Mies, precision, clean lines, steel, classical proportions. Gropius, international modern, ribbon windows, plastered surfaces, free-flowing space. But what's influential about Mies to American architects, and particularly to Eero Saarinen, it's the Mies of the houses, which is this sort of perfection. He had the same builders who made Ferraris come and weld his joints together to make this house as perfect as possible. But it's also the Mies of planning and the Mies of these large campuses, like here, the Illinois Institute of Technology. Gropius immigrated and becomes the head of the Harvard School of Architecture. Mies immigrates and becomes the head of the Armour Institute, which he renames IIT. And so both Mies and Gropius are building in America, but they are also teaching in America. And this is all happening about 1937, 1938, which is concurrent with the golden age of Cranbrook, the start of this golden period from 38 to 1940, 41, where you have Eliel and Loya at the helm, you have Pipson and Bob Swanson on the upper right, who are teaching fashion and design and product design. You have Marianne Strangel in the weaving department, Maya Grotel, Zoltan Zepeshi, Wallace Mitchell. Those of you familiar with Cranbrook know these are our sort of canon faculty. But you also see the arrival of students like Charles Eames and Harry Bertoya, Ralph Rapson, Harry Weiss, Florence Knoll, and Ray Kaiser. Meanwhile, visiting the campus, Alvar Aalto, Gunnar Asplund, Frank Lloyd Wright, and Le Corbusier and Walter Gropius both come and visit. Le Corbusier only comes to America one time, and Cranbrook is on his list of places to visit. So it's this real place, this center of thought in art and architecture. I'm going to be focusing on the architecture and thinking about how Eliel envisioned the students learning. If the teacher is a living artist, and if the student has natural gifts to become a living artist, it is very easy. You hardly need to teach him. He will find his path himself. And so Eliel led with this sort of gentle hand, and he encouraged the students to collaborate on competitions. So here we see just one example of hundreds that are in the archives of the Rome Collaborative Competition put on by the American Academy in Rome Alumni Association. And you would have students from sculpture, from painting, from architecture, and town planning getting together and entering into these competitions, and almost always coming in first, second, or third. I mean, Cranbrook just dominates these competitions because that was the curriculum, was doing these types of collaborative experiences. And here at the center, we see Eero Saarinen. He taught at Cranbrook from 39 to 41 as an assistant to his father. Henry Booth, George's son, terminated Eero's appointment as head of Cranbrook Foundation. and also asked the Saarinen-Swanson firm to leave Cranbrook's premises. But in this point, in the late 30s, Eero was this incredibly important presence on the campus. Students thought he was more in touch with recent developments in architecture than was his father, and students also appreciated, or resented, how hands-on he was. Some students commented that if they did something great, Eero would sweep in and say, "I'm your new partner." But he was sort of always around the studio, and he particularly bonded with Ralph Rapson. And I'm going to talk about Rapson for a moment here, both because I think he is an exceptional student of the era, and he goes on to have a long career in Minneapolis, but also because his family generously donated his archive back to Cranbrook. And so here at Cranbrook Archive, we're able to trace the journey of one student from Alma, Michigan High School through Alma College, University of Michigan, Cranbrook Academy of Art, MIT, and then on to his career. And he gets his start with Cranbrook when he enters into the University of Michigan's George Booth Traveling Fellowship. He does not get the fellowship, but Eliel was the judge, and he likes the drawing so much, he awards Rapson a scholarship to come to Cranbrook. And Rapson, more than most students, really shadowed Eero Saarinen once he arrived. He also got involved across multiple departments. So here you see sketching for different pitchers, pots, pans, and vases. There are hundreds of these sketches in archives. They're fascinating to go through, make an appointment, and explore for yourself. He also entered into competitions like this Modular Home for Architectural Forum, which challenged designers to come up with houses designed from standard dimensional materials using standard industrial techniques. Rapson also was experimenting with tinting and building houses out of tensile structures. And he begins to sort of introduce curves into his wares. All of this is late 30s. This is not 1950s. I mean, it looks so ahead of its time. And he designs also eco-friendly houses, like the sun house that was tracking the sun in the sky. And he's doing all of these at his desk with this just frenetic energy that I think the Academy had at that moment of students just working, working, working. It was what Frank Lloyd Wright told them in his lecture here in 1935. Work, 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 and more work. And Rapson was really living it, and he designs this cave house where we begin to see even more than curves on the tent house, we start to see the sort of boomerang curve that becomes so iconic at the mid-century moment, in which Alvar Aalto used to much acclaim and success with his Finnish pavilion of 1938. And Rapson, of course, launches himself into the national stage when he wins with Eero and Frederick James, his roommate, the competition for a theater at William and Mary. In his earliest projects, we see the influence of Gropius and the international style, more than I think we see the hand of Eero Saarinen. Other students who were here and building at that time, Harry Weiss, who built this on his family's property up north, and it's this sort of little modernist box. A year later, he would build this house for his parents, showing the sort of influence of his Swedish ancestry. It was red like a red barn, and it was actually made out of a Sears prefab trailer that we disassembled and then rebuilt in the woods. And this monumental window here actually slides open and sort of perfect for that cottage typology. Then we have people like Florence Schust, who becomes Florence Knoll, studying at Kingswood and then coming over to the Academy of Art before she launches her career as an interior designer. Also here at that moment was Charles Eames, and Charles Eames is a little different than Harry Weiss or Rapson or even Florence in that he already had an architectural practice, and so he had built to much acclaim. This is St. Mary's Church, which is what introduces Eames to Saarinen, and on the inside it is this sort of Scandinavian, early Christian, primitive interior, and Eames has designed some of his earliest seating with the pews. He's designed the lights hanging down. He was really working this sort of middle ground of modernism. It was primitive on the one hand, and it was modern on the other. What it was not was easily readable by the church, who just is utterly confounded by this design. He goes back to St. Louis and he builds houses like the Meyer House, which is sort of Georgian in its simple detailing, but it's beginning to sort of capture the spirit of Saarinen's brick. By this point, Eames has visited the campus, and Saarinen wants him to come to campus, which he does in 1938, and he stays here through 1941. Seen here, videoing Eeliel and Eero and the architecture department. Eames comes on scholarship, and then he becomes the founder of the design department. So you see him here at the drafting table. But that was not where he was most comfortable. He preferred to be in his design department. Ben Baldwin on the far right, Eames at the center, and behind them is the little chair seen here for Kleinhahn's Music Hall. So you again have this idea that your student, your instructor, you're also partner in the Saarinen office. They're designing for the Saarinen firm. And here you see the seats in buffalo, and then here's a couch. I love this chrome-plated foot. And then in 1940, Eames and Saarinen partner up on designing furniture prototypes, and they win the Organic Design and Home Furnishings competition for the Museum of Modern Art, which launches their furniture career, launches them to great acclaim. A number of different students won in different categories, but we see for the first time bent plywood furniture, sort of wire legs, hairpin legs. It's the start of mid-century modern design. And Eames was also working on designs for Cranbrook, so he designed both for Eeliel, the Smithsonian Gallery of Art. He was working with Ben Baldwin and Harry Weiss on the actual galleries of this model. And then here at Cranbrook, he designed the faculty exhibition of 1939, which was so successful as exhibit design that it remained for a number of years. And here's Charles and Eero standing on a table that was done for this exhibition. And I think looking at Charles's career from just coming here in architecture, founding design, we see this sort of interest in every item, from film to teapots to furniture to architecture. And in that sense, he's very much in the spirit of Eeliel. An Eeliel sort of idea that the architect's responsibility is the teacup to the table, to the room, to the building, to the city, is really embodied by these mid-century designers as well. The table was used to hold a model of Kleinhahn's in Buffalo. And that brings us to our final slides for our dear Eeliel, who was Mr. Saarinen about 1931, but was Pappy by 1938. So he's really become much more casual, much more familiar to the students. And this is a project. He receives the commission in 1939, a pretty spare design already. Flat roof, the volume of the church is this great rectangular form, a Sunday school wing coming across with these heavy stone columns, and then a classroom wing parallel, all centered around this tapered tower that reminds us of Kingswood and all of Saarinen's telescoping forms. Now compare this to what his son and what Eames wanted to do for the church. The heavy columns have become thin pilotis, and the tower is no longer a masonry structure, but is this great steel bell tower with the bells sort of hanging in space. And you see this tension between the two generations on one project. Now, in the end, the compromise was sort of simplifying the building into these extruded masses. We see the time here is the exact same time as the art museum, and it's the same materials, the brick, the limestone, the abstract smooth forms. And on the inside, we have more pews and seating furniture by Eames. We have this great organ screen, and opposite that organ screen is Lloyd Saarinen's, her studio's largest tapestry ever woven, the Sermon on the Mount. And this is finished in 1942. It's hung here in Millis's studio on Cranbrook's campus before it was shipped down to Indiana. But by 1945, or really 43, 44, Eliel is not getting work. He's working on various war efforts. Loya has closed her studio and is working with the League of Finnish War Orphans. And Eero has also left campus to go and work for the Office of Strategic Services in Washington, the precursor to the CIA. And here, Eero designs this sort of template for the Situation Room. And it was here where he partnered with graphic designers and industrial designers working on the war effort. And when he comes back to work with his father, he serves as consultant and then as partner in the firm run by his father and with his brother-in-law, Bob Swanson. And the major sort of wartime commission that they receive is for the General Motors Technical Center to move the design departments out of Detroit and into Warren, into this sort of streamlined campus. And these renderings by the legendary architectural renderer Hugh Ferris show this real sort of smooth surfaces, this speed. It's really art moderne. It's highly stylistic. It is not really international modern, except in moments where you have these sort of blocky buildings, but it's highly sort of rich in its detail. And Eliel's buildings of this time, though they're getting more and more modern, he never makes the leap that his son does into sort of celebrating technology with this steel bridge and this sort of floating second floor with these large plate glass windows. And so these are two projects that come out of the Saarinen office and are realized in two very different ways. Next, I want to talk about probably the single most influential design or impact on mid-century modern architecture. This is happening at the exact same time the Technical Center is being designed, 1945. John N. Tenza, the publisher of Art and Architecture, begins commissioning architects to design prototypical homes in Southern California. He starts by thinking, what is a house going to look like after the war? And he ends up influencing an entire sort of half century of design. The houses were built by real families, but then they had to be published in art and architecture, and they had to remain open to the public for a certain amount of time. There were 24 in all in Southern California. Case study house number 4, designed by our own Ralph Rapson, the Greenbelt House. And notice how Rapson includes such modern technologies as the helicopter that we could use to get to the house, and the Jeep, the great war vehicle now used for this sort of Southern California climate. And then a building that, again, reads almost as if it's made of these sort of standard parts and beams, technological materials. Eames and Saarinen are commissioned to design case study house number 8, which is built for Charles Eames and his second wife, Ray Kaiser. They met here at Cranbrook in 1940 and were married in 1941. And next door to case study house 8, Eames and Saarinen designed John N. Tenza, the publisher's own house, house number 9. And so house number 9 is here by Eero, and then house number 8 by Eero and Eames as well. And this idea of floating, remember we saw this already in Southern California, raising the house up onto columns, done by both Schindler and by Neutra, and also done in earlier projects by Eero. So this is a house for Samuel Bell, where you see Eero has floated the living spaces up on pilotis. He gets the opportunity to build one house like this before the case studies, the Vermouth House. This is for Cranbrook's contractor, the man who built Christchurch Cranbrook, Kingswood School, Cranbrook School for Boys, the Art Museum, and the Art Academy. One contractor did it all. And in 1940, he commissioned Eliel and Eero to build a house outside of Fort Wayne. And we see the sort of running of the roof down to the second floor lifted up on pilotis, and this very agrarian situation where you have the cows and things out there. And I think Eliel is responsible for this column, and Eero is responsible for this column. And they're clearly looking at Le Corbusier and his Villa Savoy. And then we look at the house again from afar, and it's part of this strain of sort of regional modernism, like the Bauhaus architect who's practicing at Harvard, Marcel Breuer. Both houses use fieldstone, they use wood, they use clapboard siding. Gone is the sort of plaster and those more sort of shishi materials, and it's a little bit hardier of an architecture. But the case study houses eliminate that sort of textural richness, and we see this machine aesthetic, the steel and the painted wood. And then we go inside, and it's full of furniture from the Eameses and from Knoll and from the other Cranbrook artists and designers. And then we look outside the house, and we see case study house number 8, which looks quite different than the earlier design. And in between Eero and Eames partnering to design this, Eames and Ray decide, you know what, we want to have a bigger volume of space. We want to have a sort of more open house, one that is less sort of controlled by this second floor. Let's use all of the steel, which was already ordered, and rebuild an entirely different house. In their words, it was an unself-conscious architecture that they could then fill with all of their things. And I think the best of mid-century modern domestic architecture always is full of things. It's full of the personality that lives within it, because the architecture isn't really giving you much of that personality. So it is a canvas for these other items, in the case of the Eameses, from their travels and of their own designs. Other case study houses designed by Cranbrook alum include the unbuilt House 19 by Don Noor, who has a long career as a designer for Knoll. And then just as a sort of example, I could have chosen any. I want to look at Pierre Koenig's house, the house for the architect, which is, again, modular construction using the standard dimensions of steel beams. You turn the corner, and the house and the garage, man and machine, all sort of wedded together. Koenig has no Cranbrook connection. He's Californian through and through, and I think he does some of the best, including my favorite case study, House 22, which you see from the street is just this closed blank wall, the steel beam going across, and we'll walk up the driveway around this fabulous wagon, and you see all of Los Angeles down below, and House 22 gives us one of the iconic images of the 20th century by Julius Schulman here. That is the architect's own family and his own furniture. The house was still under construction when this highly staged photo was taken. It's this really radical reduction in form. What does it mean to have a house? Can you have a house that is just steel beams and steel roofs? People like Neutra, though they don't do a case study house, get into the sort of luxury market of this case study house aesthetic with the Kaufmann's second vacation home, same client as Falling Water, now in Palm Springs, and you have the Viennese architect going at this sort of super luxe minimalist modernism. But for the everyday person, if you wanted to have a modern house, you could rely on people like Joseph Eichler, the great architect developer, and his partner in design, Matt Kahn, who is a Cranbrook alum who studied with Saarinen. And this is the house for Matt and his wife, who was a ceramics graduate, a Cranbrook couple, and they just passed away, and the house is now up for sale. And Eichler homes were prototypical. They were developers. They were the Levitt homes of the far west coast. And so you could go and you could buy this sort of vision of the case study houses on the developer scale. And they would make these neighborhoods of Eichler homes as we get to the sort of post-war suburban sprawl. And that brings us to the great visionary of the suburb, Frank Lloyd Wright. This is his model made by those sort of worshipers/apprentices at the Taliesin Fellowship. The model was worked on from the late 30s until Frank Lloyd Wright's death, and Broadacre City was for Frank Lloyd Wright this sort of infinitely expandable grid that featured everything you needed disseminated across the landscape. So every person has at minimum 1 acre, at most 5, 10 acres. Everything is decentralized upon the Jefferson grid. There is no center city because the city has been spread out. So towers for single people, stadiums that you would reach by your helipad or helicopters, and then these houses, which you'll notice look like little pinwheels on the model. And the typical house in Broadacre City would feature a sort of public space, the living room, dining room, at the intersection, a kitchen, and then along one edge, the bedrooms. A floor plan he developed by 1909 and now has sort of perfected and wrapped around a vegetable patch because he's all about this sort of agrarian self-sufficiency here in the suburbs. And the very first house that he builds out of this Broadacre City complex is the Jacobs House, a house for $5,000. He has to lie and manipulate the receipts to bring it in at $5,000, but it is meant to be this house for the common man. And Jacobs was a newspaper publisher who challenged Wright. You are the architect of Fallingwater, of these mansions in Chicago for the upper class. Can you build for the everyday man? And Wright wants to get in on this conversation. He wants to be part of solving the small house problem. And so he builds the Jacobs House again for publication as much as living. From the street side, it's all wall, and from the yard side, it's all glass, with the living area here and then the bedroom tail coming off. In Michigan, we have a number of these Usonian-style houses, including the second or third one built for 2 professors at Michigan State. And if we look inside, you see very humble materials. This is plywood screwed to the ceiling, the brick chimney mass, plywood furniture. The sort of client could have made this. And from the outside, it's very abstract. It's floating planes. And we see Wright now being influenced by Mies in the same way that Mies earlier had been influenced by Wright's floor plan. Now Frank Lloyd Wright is looking at the Barcelona pavilion and bringing it into a habitable structure. Closer to home, we have the Affleck House of 1946, which is the sort of wooden falling water, built for the inventor of fast-drying paint, so a very wealthy client who creates this house with sort of no expenses spared. This is Frank Lloyd Wright's system of ventilation, where the air comes under the house and then circulates through the room and out the porch. And the Afflecks went to Cranbrook, Mrs. Affleck studying weaving and their son also attending. That brings us, though, to our next house, the Melvin and Sarah Smith House. They were school teachers in the city of Detroit who were introduced to Frank Lloyd Wright through Mr. Smith's graduate work in the 1930s. He had a dream to have a Frank Lloyd Wright house. When he saw the Jacobs House, he thought, if Frank Lloyd Wright can do it for $5,000, then we can do it. And so he really, in partnership with his wife, worked on the house themselves. They build the house. They go and they study building trade catalogs in the library, and they go and they hire young workers to come out and they build this dream home. Frank Lloyd Wright visits the house. Here he is with Mrs. Wright and with Mr. Smith sitting in the home. And then from the outside, you have this, again, very blank facade. Where's the front door? Does this look like a house in a conventional sense at all? No. And then we sort of sneak in through this compressed space, and then we open up into the living room with this wall of glass on the side. But it's a very different wall of glass than the case study house walls of glass. Frank Lloyd Wright would ask of a case study house, do you like living out in the rain? Or he would call them celestial elevators. He hated these sort of glass boxes in the landscape. He wanted his architecture to be one with the earth, to be organic architecture. The Smiths live here until 1984 when Mr. Smith passes, and they fill it with Cranbrook art. So art from Cranbrook sculptors, from Cranbrook studios, from the Metropolitan Museum of Art gift shop. They really make the house their own. As we turn, we see this flow of space. So the floor plan is no longer sort of cells of room, but it's fully open into the dining room, where we can see the Smiths have ornamented the room with a screen by Glenn Michaels, who's a painting graduate of Cranbrook, the workspace, which is made of plywood. You can learn more about this house if you come and take a tour May to November with the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. But The Smith house is sort of Frank Lloyd Wright at the end of his budget. This is the cheapest Wright house he could build. But it still has these sort of amazing rooms, like the study, where you have this skylight that's like a crown sitting on top of the room. In the bedrooms, they get much more tight because Frank Lloyd Wright, he envisions that a bedroom is for sleeping. What else would you do in it? There is no need to have these private spaces bigger than necessary. Go out and be with the family. And then what is really telling as to the date, because Frank Lloyd Wright is sort of almost undateable in the uniqueness of his designs, you have this wonderful 1950 bathroom in this lovely shade of aqua. Now, the Smiths put an addition onto the house designed by Frank Lloyd Wright's apprentice, and my argument, take the tour and you'll see the addition in more detail, but I think the Smiths actually wanted a more conventional room, and so the room they add on is sort of, the dimension is a more standard room dimension, the ceiling height is more standard, and they fill it with Cranbrook art like Paul Evans and Marshall Fredericks. And then the landscape, which was designed by Thomas Church, the great landscape architect of the mid-century, I think it's kind of not what Frank Lloyd Wright would have wanted at all. It's incredibly manicured. It is incredibly almost suburban. But in that sense, Frank Lloyd Wright here achieves his great suburban dream. This is not an agrarian dream. It's not as idiosyncratic as Broadacre City. It is just a house in the suburbs. And we look at sort of Frank Lloyd Wright, and then we look at Neutra, and we see how he is in conversation with bigger trends in architecture. Where he falls off of those trends are in places like the late Usonian houses, which become built of concrete block, and you have a totally different idea of what it means to have a glass house, the Turkel House of Detroit. And I neglected to mention why they were called Usonia, an abbreviation of United States of North America. So this is a distinctly American architecture. And I think from the case study houses and from the Usonian houses, we see sort of two extremes of what domestic architecture can be at the mid-century. This sort of celebration of machine age, of standardized construction, of steel, and then the sort of celebration of the agrarian earth, but really the celebration of personality. And these houses are incredibly impactful, and students at architecture schools all across the country are studying them, they're looking at them. But how does mid-century modernism get into the average home? Well, it is through the architecture magazines. It's also through magazines like Life and Time, which are featuring these projects. And then it's through museums, whether it's the Museum of Modern Art with its sort of typical modernist house by Marcel Breuer. And notice the dates of these, 1949. The war is over, America is going to build, how do we build? And you would visit this house and you would walk through it, just like the case study houses. They would be these fabulous open houses with lines around the block. And we go into Breuer's home, and who do we see but Eero Saarinen's Grasshopper by Florence, manufactured by Knoll, and you see upholstery by Ben Baldwin, another Cranbrook graduate. Closer to home, Alexander Gerard curates the exhibition for modern living at the DIA. And this is, though there's no house constructed, you walked through the galleries and you looked into modern room after modern room. Here, a room by the Eameses. And in the catalog, which was widely published and widely sort of praised, that's where you learn the names of the makers. That's where you learn good taste. Philip Johnson is famously horrified by this show because he says Gerard's taste is so over the top and beyond the sort of purity of modernism, to the extent that Gerard has placed a doily on the Eameses' potato chip chair on the back of the book. And Gerard does design some houses. So he designs the McLucas house in Grosse Pointe, which is hidden by this mahogany wall, and then the house opens up into this private courtyard, and you see these steel members coming across, glazed brick that's left over from Eero's GM Tech Center. Eero builds a number of small houses at this time, or one small house at this time, a house for his mother, which, just like the Gerard house, which is all glass in the center, kitchen and dining, bedrooms over here. Eero does an all-glass living room, and then bedrooms on one side and kitchen on the other. This is where Loya moves after Ailill dies, and she has to be out of Saarinen House on Academy Way. And so the dimensions of the house don't come from standard materials, but come from the dimensions of Loya's magnificent rug from the Saarinen House studio, which she wants to reuse in the house. And here is Loya standing with a womb chair designed by her son, with the double portrait of her husband and son on the wall, and all of these sort of elements of their life, past and present. I appreciate the eclecticness of her house, that she has sort of Finnish church candelabras from the medieval times, all the way up to Eames's potato chip chair. Benjamin Baldwin, another graduate, gets into this much more sort of regional mid-century modernism with his house for his cousin in Montgomery, Alabama. Harry Weiss goes to Davenport, Iowa, and again builds a house on pilotis, again out of prefabricated standard dimensional lumber. And I love this picture of the family in the house and this sort of floating magnificent stair, and then these very 1950s outfits. Glenn Paulson, who comes to Bloomfield Hills to work in the Eero Saarinen office, builds this sort of very light wooden structure in Birmingham. And on the inside, it could be a case study house. So you see the sort of universal principles of design. And then Olav Hammerstrom, who's another architect who comes to Bloomfield Hills to work for Eero, builds this little weekend home in the Cape. And just an incredible sort of expression of glass, of inside and outside. And he lives here with his wife, Marianne Strangel, who is head of Cranbrook's weaving department. And so you see the house filled with textiles. And when a house is so sort of removed of ornament, removed of things that could make it yours, the architect is forced to manipulate things like chimneys to get these sort of dramatic architectural moments. So you see Hammerstrom's fabulous chimney here, another student of Saarinen, George Matsumoto, who has his chimney on the outside of the house, on the outside of this fieldstone wall. And then notice how the roof looks like it's simply leaned across this stone wall and then glass below it. Now, Matsumoto becomes a professor at UNC, and so he becomes a sort of Cranbrook mid-century modern presence in North Carolina. And he has this real affinity of using wooden beams, wooden ceilings, and then all glass around it and filling it with Cranbrook designs. In his own home and studio, you see this sort of perfect cube sitting on top of what is his architectural studio. And then a little bit later in his career, he begins building pitched roofs, which really helps with water drainage. And you see this sort of, what I'm trying to show here is the expansion of Cranbrook out, that they're not all local in Michigan, they're not all in Los Angeles. They are going everywhere, and they are part of trends that are going everywhere. And you see the modernization of family homes, and you see the sort of suburban expansion. I've just chosen this to represent that generic modernism that just begins to be built by the mid-1950s and flourishes with the sort of split levels and the ranch houses. And these owe so much to the case study houses, and they owe so much to Frank Lloyd Wright. Now, Matsumoto becomes very interested in prefabricated houses, and in 1959, he is one of 4 architects to design Westinghouse all-electric houses, new and wonderful living where electricity does everything. And so very popular at the mid-century were these catalogs where you could order blueprints and then build your own house. And so these are designs that you could order from the Westinghouse Electric Company. And what I love is on the back of the page, we have alternate exterior designs, which I think perhaps reflects the superficiality of the architecture. You know, the case study houses, a Frank Lloyd Wright house, you cannot wrap it in a new skin. The inside and the outside are influencing each other. But when it gets into this sort of pop suburban mid-century modernism, sure, just wrap any house in any skin to taste. And this brings us, this sort of suburban, almost regional modernism brings us to Edison House, which is built for Cranbrook Institute of Science in 1966, backed by CIS chairman and board of directors James Beresford, one of the Booth's son-in-law, the director of CIS Robert Hatt, and the Detroit Edison Electric Company, who is the real underwriter of this enterprise. And Edison House was built to be visiting scholars' homes, so researchers who were coming to Cranbrook's Institute of Science, and they would have a place to stay on the campus. And it was also built as a show home. So in the same way that the case study houses were open to the public, this house was open for 3 months in the summer of 1966 to show off all of the wares of this all-electric house. And here it is in relation to the Institute of Science. It sort of sits nestled in the hill. Dr. Hatt, the influential director of CIS, wanted the house to be buried. So when you drive by it, all you see is the copper roof. And then when you see the house from behind, you realize it is a 2-story home. Now, it's constructed quite like the Smith House was, using sort of a cinder block base within stacks of brick, and then redwood timbers. And it's actually solid redwood heartwoods that were shipped from the Pacific Northwest, donated like everything in the house. And then in the end, you have this building, this house that I don't know if I could defend it as a great work of architecture, but it is, I think, very typical of what was happening in 1966. It is blending together this sort of late modernism. It's blending together the case study houses. It's blending Frank Lloyd Wright, and it even has echoes of the arts and crafts movement and the sort of craftsman architecture of the suburb. What revolutionizes it in the eyes of those visitors who came through the house in '66 was that it was all electric. And so here we see the house lit up at night. To get into the house, you would park your car here and then walk through this sort of portal, past a lovely garden and into the front door, and into a second-floor living room with Eames' donated lounge chair. All the furniture was meant to be either built in or stay in the house because it was for temporary visiting scholars. And you have this wooden beam that's landing on the brick wall, the wooden ceiling supported from it, very clear structure, very understandable house. And we turn and we see, to the great consternation of Dr. Hatt, who did not understand why an electric house should be centered on a fireplace. We see a fireplace with an Academy student painting above it. I don't know much about the architect, William P. Smith. He was in the employ of Detroit Edison Company, and so I assume he was designing electrical substations. He's rather aggressive in the correspondence in the archives, always defending what he has done. Interestingly, everything he defends, I think, eventually fails, so I don't know if I would want to live in a William P. Smith house. He was living in Pontiac as of the 1930s, but I think it's almost better that we don't know much about William Smith, because I'm showing this house as a sort of typical example, and so I want that sort of typical architect. At the opening, there was an exhibition both on Thomas Edison and on the construction of the house. Thomas Edison's son, governor of New Jersey, Charles Edison, came to the dedication. He is seen here with the president of the Detroit Edison Company. And in their hands is the opening day pamphlet, which shows the Edison House on the cover, and then you open it up. We see where it's located on the campus, so we're down here at the museum, the Institute of Science here, Edison House right next door, and then the 2-story home, the driveway coming in, a central living room, kitchen, dining, and service wing, master bedroom, study, below a conference room. All that electricity has to come from somewhere, and then a sort of studio apartment. And these pamphlets were so important to these prototypical houses because they showed off what you could get if you too wanted to live in an all-electric house. And so from the insulation to the custom tiles for the house, all of these products were donated and all of them highlighted in this house of the future, including this fabulous honey beige flare range Frigidaire oven and range, seen here next to the built-in telephone, and then the oven could open and slide out, and then you could roast your turkey. And next to the oven, you can see the built-in saran wrap dispenser. On the other side of this was the built-in toaster. Rosenthal china, designed by Ben Baldwin. The electricity of the ceiling is this plastic grid with then fluorescent tubes behind it. You see pecan wood, persimmon wood, birch wood, cherry wood, and walnut wood used throughout the house. It's the Institute of Science. Make it a teaching tool. All the wood specimens are used in functional elements. And these little lights, which were rose-colored, shooting rose-colored nightlight down the stairway, and just the similarity between the stairway here and Saarinen House's own stairway as well. In the study, we see even more technology, like this Edison voice writer dictation machine. And the house was wired for phone, for TV. It had a new tone sound system throughout the house and the terrace. You can see the speakers there. And the record player flipped out here to put a record. And then there were also microphones throughout the house and microphones in the garden so that you could watch birds from the inside and hear them through the new tone speakers. As an electric house, you have to have lots of switches and various wiring. And then the fabric here looks almost hand-woven in that great Cranbrook tradition, but it's in fact, it's Corning fiberglass textiles from Knoll. And even the driveway was electrified for snow melt. The house was widely hailed in the press. Here we see the Detroit News. After they completed this house and completed the opening, it was used for a number of different scientific researchers. Dr. Hatt, in his last year at the Institute of Science, attempted to build Fermi House, which would have been an all-nuclear house, which would have been awesome. That was killed when the 1974 World Energy Conference in Monroe, Michigan, sort of cut against the idea of nuclear power. So that brings us to our next sort of phase. I've talked about the mid-century modern house and how we got to Edison House on the campus. And I want to quickly look through Saarinen's own work. We'll see how quick we can go. This is not going to be a complete lecture of Eero Saarinen, but that was all mid-century modern for the domestic sphere. That was all happening at the scale of the house. What happened when you got bigger? What would a modern monument look like? If we don't use columns anymore, what is the appropriate form of our age? And we remember what he was working on with his brother-in-law and father, same team designing the Smithsonian. General Motors, through various tribulations that you can read about in Susan Skarsgård's new history of the General Motors Technical Center, abandons this concept, and then Eero is hired to redesign it in 1949. And he takes what here were clearly defined sort of operations in space, theater, gallery, or offices, galleries, and he spreads them apart. He then orients them around a lake, anchors it all by two great domes, the Styling Dome and the Water Tower Dome. And he is looking directly at Mies, and Mies is designed for the campus of IIT on the south side of Chicago. But while IIT is this very rigorous sort of exploration of construction, of beams, of detailing, IIT is fundamentally operating at the scale of the foot, the pedestrian scale. You could even say the sort of European scale for its European architect. Eero's architecture is meant to be seen from the car. And in that sense, it could not be more appropriate for the mid-century moment as we destroy our cities for the automobile. But as such, Eero introduces color that would have never been used by Mies, with these great glazed brick surfaces that you can almost imagine cruising by in your test vehicle. And then all of it anchored by this great glinting object, which is, I think, the sort of functional equivalent of Millis's sculptures here at Cranbrook. Saarinen puts the sculptural water tower, so you always know where you are on the campus. And then you have the Styling building, which is this thin wall, just something like a 2 1/4 inch thick, which was all the papers were reporting the dimensions of this wall. And he joins the long history of glass wall architecture, from the Bauhaus to Mies and his glass wall, to even Albert Kahn in the half-ton plant, this sort of legacy of glass wall construction. But Saarinen takes it one step further and brings us into this sort of unified roof plane of glass. It's actually plastic, but you see the same system that we saw at Edison House, fluorescent tubes behind this plastic grid. And all the building services are up in the grid, and everything enclosed by this thin scrim of glass. And he can get the walls even thinner to 5/16 of an inch at IBM, and it's this sort of fundamentally American achievement to be discussing how thin you can get the wall in these buildings. But it was very important to the Saarinen office to have these sort of engineering achievements along with whatever aesthetic or functional achievements they made. These walls were engineered by the Irish architect Kevin Roach, who immigrated to work for Saarinen, and who also designed many of the details like the floating stairway here, or in the research building, this leaping stairway. And then they needed furniture, and so they turned to Knoll Planning Unit, which was established by Florence Schust Knoll in 1946, and they outfit these buildings with all of the sort of colorful chairs and custom Knoll furniture. Looking from one grid to another floating grid, we have Eero's really only entry into the canon of great houses. He did not build many houses. The Miller House in Columbus, Indiana, where, like Mies, he's using a grid, he's using steel columns, but unlike Mies, his columns, it's very unclear how this is supporting the roof. He puts skylights where there should be a beam, but he uses that grid to organize the house. So he puts 4 functional areas: the garage, the kitchen unit, the master suite, and the children's suite. And he pinwheels them out, much like Frank Lloyd Wright was pinwheeling 50 years before this, except unlike Frank Lloyd Wright, his fireplace isn't at the center, the actual house is at the center. So he's sort of pushed aside the private spaces, and you're left with the functional spaces inside. And he commissions Alexander Gerard to come and do the designs, which is, I think, the great benefit of this house is Gerard's rich use of textiles and antiques alongside the eaves and the knoll pieces. Moving to MIT, we have Saarinen exploring what does it mean to be a dome and what does it mean to find God. You have the auditorium, the Kresge Auditorium, which he thought you in the audience are sitting in a triangle, so the triangle is fundamentally the best shape of an auditorium. How can I best cover a triangle? He takes 1/8 of a grapefruit, turns it on its side, and then builds this 3-inch concrete shell, and he lands this concrete shell on these tiny little pads here, wraps it in glass, and you can see the back of the auditorium up there, so that's the back row of the theater. Across the way from the dome is the chapel, a non-denominational chapel, a great mid-century invention. And you enter it through the side, and then you sort of sneak through until you see these waving walls that are actually reflecting light from around the chapel into a pool through windows that you can't see and shining up onto these curving clinker bricks. Where are these bricks coming from? This is his father's architecture, his father's sense of materiality. And then a great screen by Harry Bertoia, Cranbrook's metalsmith, falling down. On top of it, this Theodore Roszak's spire, another work of art, sort of announcing I'm a church. And if we compare this to Mies's only example of a church, it's the same as every other Mies building. In fact, this building was used as storage for many decades because there's nothing about it that's ecclesiastical. There's nothing there that says God. Mies thought about it. He thought about welding a little cross to it. But in the end, he doesn't. Saarinen is much more interested in religious architecture, and I think this if we wanted to go really into pop psychology, we could say he's still haunted by his childhood woods in Finland. I think, in fact, he just wants to answer sort of fundamental needs of the human spirit that he found missing in Mies's work. And so you end up with North Christian Church, which is this great hexagonal church, and then you go inside, and it really just it's so evocative, it's not really Christian, it's almost primitive in its shape. And we think about his father's great octagonal church proposed for Minneapolis. And what all these buildings have in common is a sort of primal shape. So he's starting with a shape and then working out. And so for Yale's hockey rink, he starts with this sort of sleeping stegosaurus, leaping up in this great arch. And then I think quite brilliantly, he realizes that this is grounding the building. It's a sort of Viking helmet, and he wants it instead to soar. And then he puts a sculpture right at the tip. Now, the doors are covering up the actual landing of the arch. So the arch is a basic arch, and this is just an debatably unnecessary appendage. So he's added that on for the visual effect, but it's not actually doing any of the work of the hockey rink. And the building is essentially functioning like a tent. And think about Ralph Rapson and his tent architecture and this idea of how do we make form. So the arch was cast in concrete, and then steel cables brought down, and then wooden planks come across the cables. And so you have this interior that is wooden and steel. Not what you would expect from the outside, but watching a hockey game here is quite thrilling. And I hear if you skate on it, it's like skating in an open pond. It's this sort of wonderful experience. And he continues to explore that idea of the tent with his airport in Washington, where you see these two columns leaning out, connected again by steel cable, planked over, and then a thin shell of concrete poured across it. And he's so interested in the function of this airport. And so he runs through airports with his timer, and he has these detailed lists of how long it takes to get out of a car, how long does it take to get through to get through the check-in. And he wants to make this a sort of efficient machine of an airport. And so he has you approaching the airport, either being dropped off in your car or parking here, entering the building, coming through this central space, drop off your bags. The bags go by machines into the belly of the beast. You keep walking and walk straight out the building onto these vehicles that drive to the plane, and you lift up and you board the plane off of these little shuttles, which were designed with eames. It's this real whimsical idea of the airport terminal. But it's in that functional sense, it's lacking his, I think, magnum opus, the TWA terminal, which is now a hotel in Queens at JFK, which is this sort of bird sitting there. And if Dulles is meant to be this machine, well, then it takes the form, inspiring form as it is, but it's still this machine. Dulles is the bird. Though it doesn't fly, the plane doesn't inspire you. The architecture with these wings, this sort of landing on the landscape, that is what inspires you to take flight. And in his office, he would work in these enormous models so he could get a sense of the space. And then the construction, the engineers that he had working here in Bloomfield Hills are to be commended. How do you land this huge concrete vault on 4 columns? So the entire roof of the building is coming down onto 4 columns. And he was looking at contemporary shell construction. He was twisting it into something all his own. But here we see Yamasaki's airport at St. Louis, supported by the wooden substructure so they could cast these concrete arches. And the young architect who was working in Yamasaki's office on this project was Goyo Obata, who graduated from Eero Saarinen's architecture department in the early 40s and would go on to continue experimenting in shell concrete construction. Saarinen's, though, is this fluid, theatrical movement of space. And you see at the same time he's completing this, he's serving as the judge on the competition that would select Utzon to design the Sydney Opera House. So you have one master form giver against the objections of many of his fellow jury members selecting this other masterpiece of form. And then on the inside of TWA, this, again, a theater aspect to the performance of walking through these bridges, up and down these stairs, and then out to the airplane. One other project that I want to look at is back at Yale, where he's forced to sort of contend with what does it mean to be Gothic, and the Gothic architecture that was built while he was a student, which we remember is steel frame construction with then Gothic sort of pasted onto the outside. Eero, as we can see here, is much more tortured about how do you insert something into this Gothic landscape, even if it is only 20 years old, how does my building relate? And so he begins to think about unconventional ways of masonry. If IBM was 5/16 of an inch thick, well, here these walls are 2 feet thick because they're load-bearing, and they're actually stones poured into the concrete framework. The concrete is poured over the stones, the framework is removed, and then it's pressure washed to reveal these stones. And so you end up with this really unconventional rubble construction, which sort of looks like a set for Ivanhoe. That's what the critics called it. And he continues in the same way his father did at Cranbrook to put ornament into these buildings, now abstract sculptures by the Italian sculptor Constantino Nivola. And then in the dining hall, which is the great public space, we see the Saarinen's office interest in structure as you have this sort of scissor beam going down to span this clear space. And then, I lied about that being the last, we have a couple more. The embassy structure from 1960, which is Eero Saarinen figuring out how do you represent a nation? How do you be classical without being classical? I think last week we saw Eliel's answer to that, which was designing the art museum in this stripped classicism. Here, Eero is building a much more complex, much more large building, and he wraps it in these precast concrete screens, and then in what may be the single most controversial move of his entire career, he puts an eagle at the top of it, which the critics just could not get over this move. But think about where he's coming from. Think about those competitions that we saw from the 30s, where the students all work together, architect and sculptor. He's bringing sculpture into this modernism. And so here he is in 1947 with his winning design for the Jefferson National Memorial Competition, which has to get translated from a very easy move, a drawing on paper, into a built structure. And it would take 20 years to engineer this piece. Now, his arch is a catenary curve, so you see hanging in his Bloomfield Hills studio the chain. That is then simply flipped upside down. It is not a traditional way of building an arch. It is a new way of building an arch. He was so interested in the details and getting them right that at the back of his Bloomfield Hills office, they constructed the entire sequence of stairs going down into the lower level of the arch. And then after his death of a brain tumor in '61, construction begins in earnest. Here we're seeing the 2 legs of the arch wrapped in stainless steel, filled with concrete. After the halfway point, they are empty, and they continue climbing up. A steel sort of bridge is linked to keep them from falling in on each other. And then at the last day in '66, you see the final piece, the keystone of the arch, brought into place. And so you have this vision of westward expansion. You have this icon of America. It is our only modernist icon. Think of what else you associate with America or with cities. None of that is coming out of the modern era. It's generally 19th century architecture. But Eero Saarinen is able to, in one deft move, give sort of form to the 20th century. And I want to just sum up with Eero's own words about his architecture. He wasn't one to really think much about architectural theory. He never taught, but he did in 1961 sit for an interview. And he said, to sum up, I would say that the 3 great principles of modern architecture have evolved, 3 fundamental tools for a new style. 1, functional integrity. 2, honest expression of structure. 3, awareness of our time. And these first 3 are really Germanic. They're really with that idea of a zeitgeist, that you can have a spirit of the age. But later in the interview, I think he gets to much more interesting points when he says, I believe that there are three other important fundamental principles. To repeat them again, they are 4, the expression of the building; 5, the concern with total environment; 6, carrying a concept to its ultimate conclusion. And so with these 6 principles, I think we saw an architect in just an 11-year career, all those projects essentially are happening at the same time, attempt to answer what it meant to be modern, what it meant to be American, what it meant to be building for the future. Next week, we'll wrap up our series. We'll talk a little bit about the Saarinen legacy, both the office of Eero Saarinen as well as the Cranbrook students. One thing I want you to be thinking about as we go into next week is that what his father was doing here in the 30s and 40s as a school was shaping an entire movement, mid-century modernism. But that moves in 1950 to Long Lake Road, to Eero's office, and he begins to shape the next generation of architecture. Thank you.